You're live. You might be live. Okay, it seems to be working better this time than last time. Excuse me, except of course, I was going to do this, I guess in the middle of the night, and decided to wait. I was watching the videos and not necessarily fully absorbing the content of them, but I felt my comments were such that it was decent enough advice on its own to go ahead and do this and hopefully not be too long. I am rebutting two separate videos by a different creator whose name I don't know. And he likes to be funny and sing songs and do other things, and I'm going to skip all that. The first video was, well, I might be doing them in reverse order actually anyway. So I don't know which is the more current video, but they're both recent, so it doesn't matter. Anyway, the first video I'm discussing is about, the question of what makes a book generic. So when people are first starting out and they're presumably writing in genre fiction, specific genres, that might follow a formula, like, I don't know, romance novels or like sci-fi, I guess, to a degree. I think we touched on this in one of my previous videos, or two of them, maybe, excuse me, based on another different creator's videos where I had discussed, because they had introduced the idea, or actually more than one creator, I think, about incorporating screenplay formatting kind of thing as novel writing, or why they would be significantly different in the first place, I don't know. But if you see the thumbnails, you'll see where I have the two that show the story arc and all that from, just a couple weeks ago. So you can go back and watch those, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, yeah, so as a screenwriter, I a lot of times will take something that I've already kind of written as a screenplay and then try to flesh it out as a book. So as I said, it's already starting in that format. Whereas when I start a book as a book, I tend to be a little more willy-nilly and, hey, let's invent these characters and see where they go and then trim their decisions down later, which you can do that with a screenplay too. It just makes the process take longer, right? I think was the basic argument. Like, why hurt yourself? Why hurt your brain, developing all these tangents that will never go anywhere, when a screenplay is easier to write, when you just have the train on the tracks and, there's a water station here and a depot there, metaphor, blah, 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 whatever. Anyway, so his generic definition, though, was kind of all over the place on purpose, I guess, because he's trying to play with words and present different meanings for what the word generic could even mean. So at different times of the video, I kept, as I do, stopping and commenting. And so I'm not even going to address all of his, because that would just take forever and not make my point, right? Okay. So if you see that video, maybe you like his point better than my point. I don't care. I still think my point is valid, like I said. Okay, so I think the term generic regarding fiction might be slightly different than like the food metaphor. He started with cookies, by the way. We'll get into that. In that I can definitely relate to, like I said, more genre-specific terms. And I'm not necessarily an expert on all genres in fiction. There's several that I'm only slightly familiar with. And like I said, I don't know how they deviate in terms of story structure from a screenplay, but I imagine, again, that it's not really all that different. And that which is not considered for the, you know, the level of quality of books that win these awards, whatever, you know, the Pulitzer or whatever high and mighty prize that, you know, most can't even, you know, ascribe to compete on whatever level, that which is not as, you know, lowly as a romance or the pulp books, like those small publisher sci-fi things that were, you know, everywhere in the 60s and may still exist in some similar form today. Kind of like the Oscars, right? We expect that a certain type of movie, a drama, is going to win Best Picture and edge out all the comedies, no matter how good they were, and pretty much all the science fiction things, no matter how good they were, and definitely all the B horror movies, much less the A horror movies, of which there are almost none ever made anymore. What other genres exist in fiction that people usually starting out writing? The only other, I mean, the main ones, they're like books, not, you know, hop on pop or whatever. Young adult fiction, I guess, and then you've got your true romance novels, those the super pulpy ones or whatever, and then you've got the dramedies or whatever, which is kind of the same thing as the movie category, right? So young adult fiction that isn't quite romance, but also has a lot of the same themes. This is where I say young adult fiction gets generic, is the themes that center around dating or bullying or self-image, you know, and I read a bunch of them last summer. And I could not now tell you which one was which, you know, because they all had kind of the same stuff in a slightly different order of importance, maybe. Another example I might include could be Nicholas Sparks, which I talked about him extensively in a previous video where I was showing kind of a book haul. His kind of stuff, and there's other similar authors, maybe. Again, it's more dramedy than rom-com. And they kind of copy each other. Like if you see Sleepless in Seattle and Message in a Bottle, they're almost the exact same movie, except Message in a Bottle, the book, I think came out first. So credit where credit is due, maybe, to Nicholas Sparks. And I do tend to talk about movies a little bit, again, because like I know movies more than I know all the contemporary fiction, because there's like a gazillion books out there. So it's a shortcut for me to talk about a movie, especially a movie that's been made from a book. So we'll do that again in a minute. And then like that, other ones that may be similar and generic from different authors, like all those lawyer books and political intrigues and things. Like you've got, you know, John Grisham, and then whoever is similar to him. And I don't even know if I've read any of him, but I'm sure I've seen movies made from those books too. And of course, the Bourne Supremacy, the Bourne Identity, and of course, going back farther, James Bond. And so obviously any spy kind of fiction that comes now is a copy of James Bond. Is that more generic? You know, maybe in some ways. But James Bond surely had its own formula way back when. But of course, I've never read any James Bond books. I've seen several of the films, but not like super fan here. Many, like I said, many of these became movie, you know, these genres become movies more than some others, because they're a little easier to adapt, because they're action based. Whereas a book like Catcher in the Rye, you know, which is a first person narrative, you know, him babbling at a, you know, therapist, where it's supposed to be the therapist or whatever, as the reader. And yeah, whereas, you know, rom-com books and movies are usually a little bit more separate and distinct, and the movies tend to be a little funnier overall, I would say. Sight gags work better than, you know, trying to tell a joke in prose, perhaps. So then at some point, he said something about if you eat 100 cookies by the 100th cookie, even if it's the best cookie, you'll already be bored of cookies and you won't care because all the cookies have been the same. Well, I don't know who gets tired of eating cookies. I think Cookie Monster's coming after him. Gonna nom him to death, perhaps. Yeah, I mostly prefer cake, but cake is more of a special, occurrence, occasion thing. But duh, if I could type. But I don't think some, I agree. Some cookies are better than others, but sure. But I can't always afford the luxury ones. That doesn't mean that Nutter Butters or Chips Ahoy are going to be horrible. Instead of those nicer big ones you can get at the mall or whatever. So yeah, give me a break. Bad analogy time. So yes, if I have a bunch of generic Chips Ahoy cookies, and then I all of a sudden have this giant $3, chocolate chip melts in your mouth with those white chocolate bits or whatever thrown. Yes, I'm definitely going to like that better. Okay, but that doesn't mean that if all these are the same, then they are all the same. Then there's no way the last one is better than the other ones in some random way anyway. Again, unless you've changed the toppings from chocolate chips, in which case it's no longer a generic chocolate chip cookie. It's something else. So I like I said, I think he went a little off the rails there. And then he goes off the rails again when he starts talking about Stephen King. Saying that Stephen King, what he has is unique premises, so all his premises are different. And I haven't read all the Stephen King books, so I don't know if all his structures are different, but I know some of them are like bigger than the Bible and or something, and others are, about a dog with rabies, or Carrie was not even that long. Carrie was not too long. So I thought he went off the rails with the analogy a little bit there too, because if all of his novels are different, then they're not generic in that strict sense of what generic even means. Unless you mean that, again, going back to themes and stuff, that they all have low quality ingredients, like, again, B slasher films too also, but are generic brands of different goods. Like when you go to the supermarket and there's generic sugar, but then there's generic cookies, then there's generic cereal. Yeah, they're all generic, but they're generic different products, right? So that's a separate argument. Because yes, if Stephen King writes generic cereal for this book, and then he turns around and writes generic cookies for this book, I don't expect cereal and cookies to be the exact same thing. So you can say they're both generic because they both might follow a structure from, I mean, he's still writing in the horror genre typically though too. So he's not veering into sci-fi. He's not veering into romance. So I don't think any of his books are technically generic if they're all different than each other. Even if he does have some that are more basic in plot and structure. Like Cujo, it's just two people trapped in a car and a dog on the hood. Like, right? I don't know. So yeah, I don't think that's anything similar to his other stuff. Like, how could it be? So that's definitely not generic in that sense, but it is maybe more similar to when teenagers are running away from the guy with the chainsaw and they get trapped in the closet, right? Which I don't think Stephen King invented that. Okay, so bland taste usually means less sugar, actually, in generic food. That's usually where they cut corners. So again, these pulp books, what exact corners have they cut other than, I don't know, less descriptive language, less poetic language, less character development, maybe? Again, maybe more action driven, which would not necessarily be a bad thing in a sci-fi novel or even a romance novel. So I don't know where the exact breakdown would occur there, but clearly not as literary as I don't know, whatever classics we're supposed to allude to. I mean, I don't think anybody's really tried to copy Moby Dick. It hasn't become a template that I know of for how to write a really, really long book with lots of extra stuff thrown in and still get published in a modern market. It wasn't successful then, so it didn't exactly turn into successful, now. But I guess if I wanted to write a book about whaling and have a crazy captain, that would be generic. Or Sharkin, like Jaws, which there was a book that had really almost nothing to do with the movie or something. I don't know. I talked about Jaws in a screenplay video before. You can watch that one too. Okay, and some of this other stuff. Okay, but you just said that they're not unique and too much cookie cutter. Then the reader is going to get bored reading the same style again and again. Now, this is when he contradicts himself, saying that unique is bad for a writer, aspiring writer, or whatever, to try and do like Stephen King, and better to write the generic cookie cutter books. So I don't know. Then even if he says more impossible, I guess impossible to come up with unique ideas all the time, even though Stephen King does it. I don't know. Then he says it only works if these unique books are written well. Well, then I guess I was smart giving up on trying to read Naked Lunch. And I asked, does Two Towers work? Because that doesn't follow any typical novel structure. It's a bridge between two other books that was originally all one big long book that the publisher said, we need to break this up in chunks or nobody's ever going to buy them. And so Two Towers still sells well, even though the first half is like a weather report of Middle Earth over and over and over again. And then there is, in the film, it's kind of structured a little more to kind of put the climactic battle, at the key point of again, a screenplay, whereas the novel, doesn't it peter out and more stuff keeps happening for another 100 pages or something? I don't remember. I have not read that in so long, and I remembered really liking that installment when I was first reading the trilogy, because the first one had been kind of a slog. I didn't really know who was going on, what was going on. I couldn't follow who were all these characters. There wasn't 13 dwarves with all, goofy names like the Hobbit, the first tale, the Bilbo tale, if you want to. But then the Two Towers, for some reason, I felt like it was kind of breezy and easy read. And then when I read them again as adults, I was very more into Fellowship of the Ring and, oh, okay, who's this? Oh, okay, and this and this. And I got really into the world building, as they call it now. Whereas Two Towers was like nothing happens for like 200 pages. Like you could have just summed this all up in a couple paragraphs. Like they chased Frodo and never found him, or Merry and Pippin. Rather, sorry. Frodo met Gollum. I don't know. Anyway, so in the other video, so I don't know if I solved the question of what is generic fiction and what is not generic fiction, but I think that most of us, even within a genre, the point is to strive and do something slightly different or slightly more creative, where if you look at Harry Potter and think it's kind of a ripoff of Star Wars because of this and this and this and this, but it's still successful, you're kind of annoyed because yours is way more unique but hasn't found a publisher yet. I don't know. All those things. But on the other hand, you have to have your original twist on it. You can't just write, Mary Potter, the female wizard who's, pal Hermanish, follows her around and teaches her spells or whatever. It's just going to be, that's not generic anymore. That's just copyright infringement, right? Okay. So there is a fine line there, I guess. And again, Message in a Bottle and Sleepless in Seattle, they're different enough. Again, I think one is actually better than the other, but in those differences, we find our, not necessarily our voice, but our, and not our niche, I guess, niche. Our, I never bothered with the whole Game of Thrones thing, but I'm sure it's heavily based on something else. I get fantasy, not really my thing either. Although that one, less fantasy and more intrigue, but in a fantasy realm where I've dabbled. So many of you others also have. And now that became such an epic hit, I'm sure even more. So maybe I won't bother, but some of you might. But again, you can't just copy Game of Thrones because everybody who's interested in that kind of thing has already pretty much watched it. You have to wait for the next generation to come along or whatever. So he was saying there's a distinction between unsatisfying and dissatisfying. And he wants you to write a novel that is unsatisfying to keep the reader unsettled, to keep them reading. And whether or not they feel that way at the end without proper resolution might lead them to being more dissatisfied than unsatisfied enough to keep reading. Okay, so that was a pretty easy point that for some reason was a 12-minute video. And I don't remember all his points, but I sure made plenty of comments, as is my want. And so this video's, we're finally getting into part 2, but it's longer than I thought it might be, but that's because I like to talk and who cares. I feel like I'm stuck just mostly remembering novels that I had to read in school for a grade. So it didn't matter if I was satisfied with the books at the end because I was expected to absorb the material whether I cared for it at all or not, you know. So I know I've read books for pleasure both before and since, and I know I've reread a couple of those assigned books because I wanted to, but overall those were important stories that otherwise maybe I never would have bothered with in the first place. And then I think back on all these other famous ones that weren't assigned, and I still haven't read them, like, I don't know, a bunch of Dickens and Tolstoy and whatever. And even Hemingway. I'll talk about this in all a minute. But this doesn't discourage me as a writer so much, like that line in Before Sunset where she says, you know, she still liked his book, even though she never read, you know, War and Peace or whatever. But I guess there's movies and things I could point out where I just want to see the bits that are satisfying over and over and stop watching rather than slog through the whole thing to the end again if it's one that I've seen a bunch of times. Forrest Gump especially comes to mind. Actually, Apocalypse Now too, I should have mentioned. There's a movie that you want to see a few scenes more than maybe, you know, all 3 hours. And it's episodic, both of them kind of are. So yeah, once Forrest, he's running back and forth across the country, I'm not really going to sit through the next commercial break. You know, if I had sat down and started watching it, at whatever point it stops there, if I'm already far enough into the movie that I know what's, you know, coming, it's kind of like, okay, I already know Jenny dies. Like, spoiler alert, you know, like I don't need to see all that part again. I'm tired. I'm pretty tired. I'm going to go home too. Yeah. This, of course, is different than the Fast Times at Ridgemont High syndrome where all the video cassettes were worn out at that one spot of Phoebe Cates in the pool. And I've made videos about both Apocalypse Now and Fast Times at Ridgemont High. So I'm not going to go into that. Then he tries to make another food metaphor and he rags on Arby's, which is a place I don't eat very often since I was young. But I'd rather have Arby's than a lot of other meals I could mention. That boiled glove he references may be similar to some things I've had recently anyway, where Arby's would have been way better. True story. Ask my dentist, he'll tell you. Don't chew boiled leather. True. Again, that's the unsatisfy versus dissatisfy thing, where this analogy could have been sooner and the video could have been shorter. It takes a lot less time to rewatch a movie than reread a book, of course, so that happens a lot more with age. But I still want to watch, more movies that I haven't seen than just see the same ones again and again and again from when I was a teenager or whatever, I guess. Even certain films that maybe I didn't fully understand them that I might appreciate more now, like certain foreign things or whatever. I'm probably not going to sit through them again because just reading the subtitles is, distracting or whatever. But of course, I do still watch some of the same foreign movies again because I like them better than, I don't know, generic slasher horror movies or whatever that comes out more often than other things. I didn't see a single movie in the theater last year. I couldn't tell you if any of them were worth paying money to see, and I doubt it. I almost went to see Paddington. That was like the one. Not my typical type of movie either, but I didn't grow up with Paddington, but I recognize him and I was kind of curious, and so I'll probably see that on pay-per-view. This is a total aside, has nothing to do with my previous comments. Okay. Then he talked about some books that have unsatisfying-ish endings. And one of the ones he mentioned was, dun, 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 drum roll, and I just did a video about this, like a month or two ago. Brave New World, which I just finally finished reading. I had suggested, and I was thinking about doing a video about the book on its own, wherein it ties in with the minimalism versus consumerism thing about the riches and stitches or whatever little parable. But I'm not going to do that too much here because this video is already long and doesn't really have anything to do with it. So I just finished Brave New World, and I didn't feel like the ending was abrupt so much as not quite as I expected. But it's also an older book than some of the others, like 1984, and I forget what other ones he mentioned. What the science, obviously the science doesn't quite match up. I think the one that most people would look at, Brave New World, would maybe equate with the Matrix. But it's not. But again, the Matrix is definitely an action sci-fi movie more than this kind of thing. They both have a similar, like, one bit. Again, if you're going to write Harry Potter, yes, it can still be set in an academic wizard school, but then pretty much everything else has to be your own, right? The concept of academic wizard school, I don't know that they can copyright, but you have to change your Hagrid guy to a different guy. And I thought a lot of I've talked about Harry Potter before. I thought a lot of the Harry Potter books, which I haven't read, but the movies were like, oh, gee, do you think that's the bad guy? Like, it was kind of dead giveaway for pretty much all of them. So the science and the vision and such, it was kind of viewed through that. It was written during the Great Depression, so that kind of naivete or whatever. Huxley deals with adult themes. He's not. I don't know. It's not. It's definitely not young fiction, but most people, I think, still read it when they're young. So I don't know if it's assigned in high schools, maybe colleges. But that book, the problem for me is overall, I just wasn't as invested in most of the characters that I guess I was supposed to be, because every single chapter there's a new one who's now the new main guy all of a sudden, and then on top of that, they're all going off on their own little adventures instead of whatever I thought might happen, the adventures that I would have chose for them. So then I finished, and I wasn't sure if I should still care or not, but at least I, got through it after years and years of it sitting on the shelf, neglected, when others had recommended it to me. But now nobody else I know has, read it any time lately that will still care if I did do a summation right now. Some of you tuning in might want to, discuss it in the comments or whatever. Fine. Jog my memory, because I tend to not retain stuff as literature as well as I used to. Again, if I watch a movie, I'm more likely to remember a bunch of what happened because it's visual. Whereas in the books, all the language and stuff and like, yeah, I might remember certain scenes better than others, but the overall thing, forget it. It's just, so he was saying that, some books leave you with a lot of unanswered questions. I prefer the questions to be answered, or why the hell am I reading this crap? Just straight up. So if you're writing a book, here's my bit of advice. Yes, wrap up most of those questions, unless you're planning a sequel, because you're doing that kind of genre where, a sequel is expected. And even then, as the other people will recommend, wrap up like 95% of the stuff in the first book and leave a couple open-ended things. Like in Star Wars, the story's basically wrapped up, but Darth Vader's still alive. That's like the Empire still exists. That's the big, and that, and they weren't even technically planning a sequel at that time, but then he made $1 billion and got to make the sequel. And then of course the sequel, that one was totally like, what? Unsatisfying ending for sure. What do you mean this is the father? Well, that was a question actually answered, just nobody liked the answer. So that's slightly different. So again, that goes to dissatisfaction. And so the outcome, Luke got his hand cut off. They talked about this in Clerks already, so I don't have to go into why Randall likes Empire better or whatever. You can have your own opinion. That's not the point. The point is, if you just saw Empire Strikes Back on its own without having seen the first movie, you would partly maybe be confused as to why you're watching this in the first place. But I think you'd pick up on who the characters and things are pretty quickly. It's not that opaque, and there aren't that many characters. And yeah, some of the Luke and the ghost appearing to Luke at the beginning, right? Well, they did that in Hamlet, and nobody seemed to have a problem with it. So I guess if you're not familiar with Obi-Wan from the first movie, it's not going to bother you that much that this mystical guy shows up in the go to Dagobah. Okay, I'll go do that then. And this guy that you have no, other real investment in goes to Dagobah and has this journey where he stops being such a whiny butt and starts becoming a warrior, but he's still a whiny butt warrior. That character arc still works. If you haven't seen the first film, where he's pretty much just a whiny butt. So, but then he's also all of a sudden an awesome pilot. Whatever. Then he talked about Steinbeck, and this is kind of the last point, so that's why I'm just having fun yapping about Star Wars and junk for the one person who might accidentally make it this far. Like I said earlier, this is my callback. I've read most of the Steinbeck books, not assigned, but at the peril of other authors like Hemingway that never got the same fair look. And definitely out of the bunch, Grapes of Wrath is one of the few really worth the effort in hindsight to actually read the whole thing. East of Eden should have been way shorter for that conclusion. Talk about, it's not that it was dissatisfying, it's just that it was another spoiler alert. The joke is your mom wears combat boots. So there's but they made movies for both of those books already anyway, so maybe you can make the remake of the Hollywood only does remakes of adaptations of stuff now, etc., etc. 34 minutes, not too bad, I guess. So anyway, yeah, I don't know if that helped as much as I would like or hope or whatever, but hopefully it sparked some thoughts in your brain. Again, me piggybacking on some other people's content with some valid points in how you pursue your own. Again, applicable to both novels or screenwriting or novellas or whatever, as far as I'm concerned. And So if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the comments and we'll have a discussion for a change, perhaps, if you got this far and just want to talk about why Harry Potter is better than Steinbeck or Game of Thrones is way better than Lord of the Rings or whatever. You still won't convince me that I'm going to read Harry Potter or Game of Thrones, no matter how hard you try, because that's never, ever, ever going to happen. And I'm never, ever going to watch Game of Thrones because I already watched Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings and blah, blah, blah. Or generic horror films or whatever else. But yes, again, the easiest thing I can list is, B horror films where the guy is chasing a bunch of teenagers. That's about as generic as you can get. Not usually very much deviation in I don't know if the black guy always dies first. Maybe mix it up there. So, another joke from, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, if you know, you know. No, I've never actually written one of those movies. And I started one once because, not just to do it, because I thought there was actual funding coming. And it turned into something else almost immediately because I had absolutely no feeling for it. I mean, I could have done it if I really, really wanted to, but after writing for a couple of weeks and that money didn't show up, I was like, oh, good, free, don't have to, don't need to fit, kind of like reading Naked Lunch. Don't have to, you can't make me, and started writing a totally different thing, which at the time I did think was actually unique, and I might revisit it one of these days, but I think it's also been done since. I think it might be to scuttle my own boat. Along the lines of Talented Mr. Ripley, maybe, which I think I saw once, but I don't remember it very well. So I don't know. I might be wrong. I might be completely off base. I might watch that again sometime soon because that's not a teen movie that I've seen 800 times. And since I don't remember it well enough to talk about it, maybe I'm, like I said, completely wrong. But something dark academia along those lines. Blah, blah, blah. And since I have Dark Academia in the title, I might as well throw in the buzzword here before we wrap it up. Okay, wrapping it up now, officially going on to Thursday.